Hello and welcome back to another video. In this one, it is ahead of the main events of the Russian summer offensive. Therefore, I believe that it is the appropriate time to be talking about Russian logistics. How are the Russians able to launch large-scale offensive operations consistently over a long period of time? To understand this, we have to take a look at how the process goes. There are 4 steps to this process, from the production of the logistics, the supplies, to the delivery of them to the front line. Let's take an example of ammunition. Let's say there's an ammunition plant in the city of Rostov-on-Don along the Don River in western Russia. The majority of Russian munitions production sites are located in western Russia. The example here is supplies go to Rostov and ammunition is being produced from these supplies. That is the first step, the production of the supplies. Then the second step is the transportation of these supplies from the production site to a major logistical hub within Ukraine or along the rear of the front line. As an example, the city of Donetsk. There are massive ammunition depots all across southern and eastern Ukraine in the rear, away from the front line, away from the fire of Ukrainian long-range strikes, such as artillery. The more medium range from 0 to 100 kilometers usually covers the vast majority of Ukrainian long-range strike capabilities, while what is beyond that is still possible for the Ukrainians to strike it. It is very limited compared to the first 100 kilometers. So this is where all the major ammunition depots are located. So the first step is the production. The second step is the delivery of the produced ammunition from the city outside of the country into the rear of the fighting. In this example, the Russians transport ammunition from Rostov-on-Don to Donetsk mainly through rail and trucks. Once the Russians transport a lot of ammunition in the vicinity of Donetsk city, usually away from residential areas to avoid casualties if the Ukrainians strike them, and generally for safekeeping and safety, protection, and so on. These ammunition depots are large. They have a lot of equipment and supplies. The trucks then arrive at these depots. An example, we put one here in southern Donetsk. The trucks then drive up to the location, picks up ammunition, and drives it to a logistical hub much closer to the front line. In this example, Selidove, for the fighting in Pokrovsk. So from a major ammunition depot to a smaller ammunition depot. While the ammunition depots in the vicinity of Donetsk would likely be able to supply a large army of 100 or 200,000 soldiers constantly being refilled and supplied, the ones near the front line are for much smaller units. Selidove had a pre-war population of approximately 20,000 people. While the town itself is now deep within Russian territory, about 10-20 kilometers from the front line, depending on which part of it, the area is mostly evacuated from civilians completely. This means very few civilians are there, and at least the majority of the city open for military activity. This also means that the Russians are able to concentrate ammunition depots in basements of buildings and generally spreading it out within the town. Being able to put logistics here considerably shortens the distance between the frontline positions and resupplying. This means trucks that resupplies would have to drive a much shorter distance than from the city of Donetsk. But this also limits the amount of supplies available, and the forces it can supply is much fewer. In this scenario, the city of Donetsk is well supplied, can supply hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Selidove itself would likely be able to supply 1 or 2 brigades. This means that a small section of the front line can be supplied from Selidove, which means additional supply hubs would be needed near the front line to supply more forces. It could be Novotroitsk, Novolenivka, different small towns, but the smaller the town is, the fewer supplies can be concentrated in these areas. Therefore, the Russians would need additional larger towns under their control to supply their forces properly, because they would be able to concentrate more ammunition in a smaller area. The capture of Rodivka and Novorodivka, here in the eastern section, allowed the Russians to supply their forces for the capture of Selidove. Capturing that, as well as Kurakhove in the south, allowed the Russians to develop offensive operations in the direction of Pokrovsk. However, they would never be able to compare to Pokrovsk itself. The close proximity to the front line allowed the Ukrainians to supply a lot of their forces from the city, while the Russians had spread out smaller towns to supply their forces on a wide section of the front line. One of the best examples of this is the Velika Novosilka section of the front line. The close proximity to Donetsk allows Russian forces to supply their forces in the direction of the town. However, the supplies close to the front line are very limited. The largest town in the area is Velika Novosilka, which cannot supply that many forces, at most a battalion or two. While the necessary forces in such a wide section of the area would make it difficult for Velika Novosilka by itself to supply the Russian forces. Instead, they need to spread it out with Kurakhove, Andreevka, Bahatir, Komar, Velika Novosilka, and many other areas of the front line. This means that many smaller units can work together, but no large division-sized units or similar will be able to operate in this section of the front line. Instead, this is why we see developments and offensive operations west of Pokrovsk as the Russians target areas such as Novopavlivka, Meshova, towns such as Pokrovsk, are all targets for the Russian forces going forward, because they need to capture these towns and cities where they can concentrate their supplies and logistics and operate from these areas close to the front line. Why is it necessary to have logistical areas close to the front line, not just Donetsk city, which can supply 100 or 200,000 soldiers? Why would they need to have areas close to the front line? Because when a Russian soldier, for example, storms the city of Pokrovsk, they're inside the residential area. The soldier right here at the front line would need supplies on a daily basis. He would likely use up his ammunition, he would need water, food. He cannot carry all of it with him to the front line and stay there for weeks. So he needs to constantly be resupplied. Having a truck driving from the city of Donetsk to Pokrovsk consistently every day, they would need hundreds of trucks driving tens of kilometers, and the Ukrainians would know that, and therefore they would have drones constantly flying overhead, striking these trucks, and the Russian supply lines would be stretched thin, they would be destroyed, and would not be able to resupply their forces. Instead, having supplies stationed in Selidove, for example, significantly shortens the distance the Russians have to drive towards the front line, if that is the way to do it. They can also transport it to settlements such as Shevchenko, very close to the front line, where they can have drones fly overhead with water, food, ammunition, smaller loads of supplies, have them fly to the front line and hand it over to Russian soldiers near the front. They can also have additional forces going forward with armored vehicles, having extra supplies with them, not just for themselves, but also for the soldiers already there, supplying each other. Generally, it is about the vulnerability to enemy fire, in this case, Ukrainian fire on Russian logistics. The shorter the distance, the less opportunities the Ukrainians would have to strike their supplies, and the closer the distance, the more options there are to resupply the forces. At a short distance, let's say Sverove, to the front line near Troyanda, a Russian soldier can put on a backpack that has supplies for both and then move to the front and then back again. You can also go on an electric scooter, motorbike, or no regular bike. There are much more options for short distance than long distance. At long distance, you would need trucks, trains. But at a short distance, you have much more options, and it allows for much safer supplies to the front line. Therefore, the Russians, if they want to launch a large-scale offensive, they would need to have control over larger logistical hubs. Therefore, if we take a closer look at the Pokrovsk direction, we can see that there are many areas where the Ukrainians can resupply their forces from. They have both the cities of Mynarad and Pokrovsk, which have a lot of supplies located within them. There's Risheve, there's Serhivka, there's Rudinsky, there's Pilitsky. In the rear there is Dibropilya, and there are many logistical hubs for the Ukrainians to resupply their forces. If the Russians manage to gain control over Beletsky, Rudinsky, Mirnorod, and Pokrovsk, they'll be able to concentrate a significant amount of forces. Pokrovsk and Mirnorod alone can supply a division each. This will allow the Russians to supply 50,000 or 100,000 soldiers within this area. Of course, it'll take time to build up the initial supplies for the initial offensive operations to begin, but the Russians would, with time, be able to supply a significant force here in the rear of the Sloviansk-Kościantynivka line. Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Droshkivka, and Kościantynivka is the main defensive line of the Ukrainians, as we see with the fortifications that has been prepared in this direction. But what we don't talk about a lot or often is the supplies that is located within these areas being enough to supply a significant portion of the front line for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are able to put up heavy resistance in Chasiv Yar because their forces will constantly be resupplied through Kościantynivka. The line itself has 3 larger cities and 1 small one with several large towns. It also has direct rail connection towards Sloviansk from Kharkiv. There are several highways that lead into the region. From this, it is clear the Ukrainians are well supplied within the Sloviansk-Kościantynivka line. If the Russians are able to operationally encircle Kościantynivka, it will still take time for the supplies to be used up. The Ukrainians will not need to resupply a lot at the start, but the later the siege goes, the more difficult it becomes for the Ukrainians to keep up their defenses. This means with operational encirclement, it is a slow grind for a small advantage to be gained day by day until eventually the one operationally encircling the other gets an advantage to enter the city and start the siege and storming of it to gain control of it. Transferring control of one city from one side to the other begins a progress of resupply where a supply hub is being built for future offensive operations. And that is the importance of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. It allows the Russians to switch from Velika Novosilka, Kurakhove, Selidove to Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, almost 5 to 10 doubling the amount of forces they can operate within the area, and we could see much larger offensive operations taking place by the Russians. If they are able to push into the Dnipropetrovsk region, following that, they'll be able to gain control of additional logistical hubs and launch even larger offensive operations, isolating the Ukrainian forces and limiting the Ukrainian resupply abilities and logistical capabilities, while significantly strengthening their own, overturns the power balance in favor of the Russians for offensive operations, which will speed up the Russian progress and increase the casualties the Ukrainians are taking because they will be less supplied and the Russians will be better supplied. And we are seeing additional examples of this. An example is the Siversk section of the front line. The Russians will be able to push from the Seshansk and Seversk-Donetsk all the way to Siversk. If they gain control over Siversk, they'll have an additional logistical hub for pushes in the western direction, while the Ukrainians would be resupplying from the Sloviansk and Kramatorsk cities. The Russians would be resupplying from Siversk. This clearly shows a significant advantage to the Ukrainians. If the Russians also gain control over Liman, suddenly their situation significantly improves. The Russians have control over Bakhmut, which allowed them to contest Chasiv Yar in favor of them. Despite the Ukrainian resistance and supply from Kościantynivka, the Russians with the supply from Bakhmut were able to contest the Ukrainian presence in the area. Without the capture of Bakhmut, if they had to push through from the Toretsk direction or from the flanks of Bakhmut, they would not be able to sustain such a long battle and heavy battle as we have seen. The capture of Toretsk to the southeast of Kościantynivka and the capture of Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar to the northeast of Kościantynivka significantly strengthens the Russian offensive capabilities to the south and to the east of the city. However, the western parts is not well supplied. the main supplies going through to the front line and the northeastern flank of Pokrovsk goes through the Avdiivka direction. The city of Avdiivka is likely only supplying this area here in between Kościantynivka and Pokrovsk. This entire section of the front line is supplied mainly through Avdiivka. There are several towns and villages in between Avdiivka and the front line, which are midpoint drop-off points where the Russians supply these locations, and these locations then push on the supplies further and further up towards the front line. However, it is clear there are large open fields which the Russians have to pass through, which significantly complicates the resupply of their forces, which really raises the question as to how the Russians were capable of gaining control over such a vast area with such poor resupply capabilities. The answer for which I do not have. I would love to figure out how. But in the end, what we're seeing is that the closer to a city the Ukrainians are, the stronger their defense. The further away they are, the weaker the defense. And similarly, the closer to a city the Russians are, the stronger their attack. The further away, the weaker. This is why the Battle of Chasiv Yar, despite lasting for so long, almost 2 years, the Russians and the Ukrainians were not ignoring this section of the front line. Neither were it a secondary objective. Instead, the Russians and the Ukrainians simply had so many forces in this direction that even wiping out an entire company or battalion would just reintroduce a new company or battalion to replace them, because they had such good logistics on both sides, allowing both sides to constantly be attacking, launching artillery strikes, FPV drone strikes, and so on. The Ukrainian lines, again, due to a lack of manpower, still had gaps in them which the Russians exploited, allowing for advance at a very slow rate. But due to the well supplies of the Ukrainians, they were able to close many of these gaps quickly before the Russians broke through the Ukrainian lines. And that is going to be all about the logistics for the frontline situation and their developments over the past few years and months. The objective of this war is really just a battle over attrition and logistics. Who can provide the most firepower to the front line and make best use of it. The closer you are to a city, the better off you are. And that is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.